Over to James. James, we're going to hear from part two, are we? Yeah, it's an exciting adventure. I think you need to the microphone, James.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Thank you, everybody. Before I get started, all my presentations have a very loose conceit or metaphor. This one here, I don't know if anyone recognizes this slightly viral YouTube video from the early 2010s of these amateur actors and wannabe commercial actors in America. One of the lines that they had to keep repeating in this very funny, absurd video was, "You could stop at 5 or 6 stores or just one." So that's going to be the loose conceit of my presentation. We're taking all the different information sources that we have from our students and putting them in one location, hopefully for their benefit. So this presentation is also going to be a bit of a tying together of a bunch of education showcase and other type of presentations we've given across the years of stuff we're trying in the school. Starting back almost 3 years ago now, so Education Showcase in 2023, I talked about a new type of assessment that we were trying out in our school. So the lecture quizzes assessment was an attempt to get students back into the lecture theatre, but also get them to regularly engage with lecture material in a distributed way across the semester. And so because of that type of assessment, students were producing data with their engagement with our learning activities every single week. We have iterated this assessment in a few different ways since 2023, and we believe we've made it better for student experiences, but also for the main type of what we are wanting students to get from this assessment, which is regularly engaging with lecture content. And so now the assessment is called lecture engagement as opposed to lecture quizzes, and students have the freedom to either attend in person and participate in an activity in the lecture, or they can watch the recording of the lecture on Canvas by a certain time. And so there is even more data that students are producing by being involved in this particular type of assessment. And just that graph on the right-hand side of the screen there is that there is a academic benefit, we believe, to students engaging with this assessment, but I can talk about that at another time. In addition to lecture engagement and the other types of learning activities and assessments we have, also in our units now, we have begun to have minimum attendance thresholds on tutorials. And so these are absent fail triggers. And so because of that, accurate recording of student attendance at tutorials is also very, very important. And so this is more and more data that we are collecting on students and students produce by being involved in our units than they already did. And there was already a quite significant amount of data that students were producing. So you may be familiar with the Student Relationship Engagement System, or SRES, at the university. So with great thanks to Danny Liu and his technical team for creating this portal. It is a university-based system which can bring together all of these different data sources that students are producing. So through Canvas, but also other external sources that you can manually upload to SRES. It is a fantastic system, and it's driving a lot of what we are going to be talking about in this presentation. So with SRES, so it can connect to the Canvas site and bring in all the data and metadata that is coming from Canvas, but it also allows you to create your own data sources and your own forms, your own portals, upload external data that you have, whatever it may be. And so it's a relatively powerful tool. And if you haven't played around with it, which I imagine some of you probably have, I definitely would recommend introducing it into your units. And I'll hopefully justify why across this presentation. But one of the most powerful things of SRES is this portal function. So the ability to take all of the data sources that students are producing and their individual data and present it back to them through a portal in an individual way. And the benefit for academics and instructional designers and everything is that you get to basically code together and hack together this portal, which is pulling in individual data sources for students. And so you're not manually reporting to students their data. It is automatically collating and collecting from all these different sources and then individualizing it to the individual students. And I've got some examples that I'll show throughout this presentation as well. So because of this, all of our units having different types of assessments that we want students to be able to know how they are going with and being able to report the data back to them so they can check it for themselves, but also know how they're going, we are using these SRES portals in the form of a Track Your Progress portal. So most of our units now on the homepage of their Canvas sites, when students land there, they can click on this Track Your Progress portal and get all of this individualized, personalized data for them, and they can track their progress across the semester. So here's an example from Psych 100 in this semester. So there were quite a few learning activities and things that students were doing that produced data that they could use to track how they were going. And so this is some examples here. So from the base level of tutorial attendance, so tutors are using SRES to mark automatically whether a student is present or absent, and then this can then be fed back to them so they can track how they're going across the semester. The Foundations of Learning log assessment that Alyssa was alluding to before. So they are doing this weekly across the semester so they can see whether or not it has been accepted, completed, whether there was no submission, whether some parts that were missing. All of this, again, is automated for each of these students based on how they're engaging with these portals. Lecture engagement, so whether or not they attended, whether or not they watched, we have this data available to them every single week, and they can track how they're going across the semester. Whether it's actual formative assessments or summative assessments, so the guided research report annotated draft introduction that Alyssa was talking about, so this is being fed back to them in this same portal, and they can see the information there for their reference when it came to then doing the final guided research report and having to actually integrate the feedback that they got from their tutor if they completed this part. Then the summative assessments, so marking of written assessments, we're going to be using SRS for that purpose as well, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of a minute. But yeah, presenting this back to students as well through the Track Your Progress portal. In addition to the marks that students are getting from their tutors, other information about their submission dates, late penalties, all this sort of stuff, we can automate and collate in SRS and report back to the students. So, students' experience of these Track Your Progress portals. So on the left-hand side of this slide here is going to be open-ended comments from most recent USSs from semester 1. So finding that it guided their learning, that they were able to track your progress in the semester, having the very clear and effective portal, a great way of tracking their work across the semester, like that they were able to track their progress. But I think the key takeaway here is not remaining in the dark about how they're going. So from this feedback purposes, letting them know across the semester how it is they're engaging with their units, not remaining in the dark is one of the main motivations for this. So the helpful feedback item, the one that we don't do so well on normally in the school, but also I guess the faculty and university overall. So in the red here, we have units that did have full Track Your Progress portals, and on the right-hand side is units that didn't have Track Your Progress portals. And so there was a clear difference there. Just a very large grain of salt, though, that I want to put on top of this, though, is that it's not because of these Track Your Progress portals. In order for there to be a full Track Your Progress portal that has all this information, it's because the unit has been designed and structured in a way that there are learning activities and assessments that students are doing across the semester. And so there is information to present back to them. So it's not the portal itself, it's the design of the unit, but nevertheless. Moving on to the second part of my title, which was about good practice in feedback. So linking together some initiatives and stuff I've tried across the years. In the grad cert, one of the units here at the university is about educational technologies. In that particular assessment, I was coming up with a plan for integrating university-based educational technology, Cogniti, as a possible solution for turning summative assessments into more formative assessments. And so starting to think about what are some good practices approaches to feedback, namely the Hattie and Timperley model. And so I presented on this last week at the Science Education Community of Practice as well. I'm talking about the affordances of Cogniti, in particular when it comes to feedback and what good purposes it has for giving feedback to students. And so in semester 2 last year and semester 1 this year, we were able to use Cogniti agents for this formative feedback agent in the main written assessment in Psych 100 and 100 Here are some examples of just the very simple, relatively simple system prompt that we were giving to this agent about it being a expert psychology tutor that is going to be helping students give formative feedback on their written assessment, what the rules, what it can do, what it can't do, not doing things for the student, making sure you're paying attention to the rubric and structure and topic that we are giving you. When it comes to students not giving any sort of drafts or anything to go off, don't give them something, actually try and prompt them towards generating text themselves, but then also importantly, structuring of feedback. So in the Hattie and Timperley model, which I'll talk about in this in a second, in a couple of slides, structuring feedback in a particular way that is helpful for students, making sure the agent was doing that too. So we have some examples here of students interacting with the agent. The student was asking it to give it a title. It wouldn't. It would prompt them. So asking them to think about across this whole entire conversation here, important things to think about what the title of the research report should have. And then after through many, many different rounds, then they came towards the title at the very end. So very importantly, not doing it for them. When it comes to feedback, so students were able to put drafts, entire drafts of their introduction and discussion sections, or even just excerpts into the agent. And so we were structuring the feedback in a hopefully evidence-based way. Repeating back to the students what it is that they were supposed to be doing, what the task required of them, measuring them against that. So how were they going, how they measured against that particular task, but then importantly, where to next. So taking this feedback and making some improvement. So often it was going to be one tiny little improvement, moving from one grade boundary to another. But yeah, that was the general approach towards giving this feedback to students. But also, again, importantly, where possible, not doing it for them. So this student asked, where can I cut 70 words? And it was prompting questions rather than saying exactly where you could cut 70 words. So as Alyssa alluded to before, so the results for the unit when it came to helpful feedback was shooting through the roof. So we were definitely glad to see that. But in general, units that had formative cognitive agents, again, the helpful feedback score was definitely better than units that did not have formative cognitive agents. Another large grain of salt, though, again, it's not because of the cognitive agent itself, but rather the unit coordinator and their approach to the unit and all the other things that has been helpful for students. But the cognitive agent is probably one tiny part that is contributing to this. Moving on to my second last thing to talk about here. So using SRES for the marking process. So as you would know, within SpeedGrader with written assessments, it has a rubric function and you can use rubrics within SpeedGrader. They're not the best though, from like a user experience and in terms of what you can do with the data that results from them. So with our units that were trying all these different things, we were using SRES and we were creating marking rubrics within SRES. So this is what it would look like for a tutor. On the right-hand side of their screen, they would have SpeedGrader open where they could then leave written comments on the actual submission, but the marking rubric and what students would get feedback from was on the left-hand side here and embedded on Canvas for their access. Within the marking rubric, so a little bit more granular than probably rubrics tend to be generally. For each rubric item, there would be a button that tutors would press, and when it comes to either fail, pass, distinction, perfect, whatever it might be, but there was a longer prose sentence that was attached to every single one of those buttons. And so tutors themselves weren't writing those prose sentences. They would just type or press the button, and then this prose sentence that was related to that particular gradation would then be able to be reported back to students later. So hopefully saving some time there. Here's an example of what this feedback would look like in the SRES portal, the Track Your Progress portal. So structuring it again and hopefully in an evidence-based way. So letting students know what the task was, where were they going, letting them know how they measured against it, and so how they were actually going with these sorts of longer prose descriptions for every single rubric item that was selected and the gradation that was selected by the tutor. But then also where to next. So the overall comment, that was still there as well. So sometimes comments from some tutors were shorter rather than longer, but hopefully the point is letting them know, here's how you measured against this particular task, and here's how you can improve for next time. And this was all reported back to them in the feedback portal, or the Track Your Progress portal, should I say. So some issues was that if you try and make the SRES marking rubric as streamlined as you possibly can, it will necessitate having to actually put written comments in SpeedGrader. So there's this like lack of co-location of the marking rubric and then the other comments that are in SpeedGrader, which is not ideal. So that's something that we're trying to look to improve. But also some assessments themselves may not lend themselves to be marked by an SRES rubric. So just acknowledging that up front. Again, if you're referring to helpful feedback, units that had SRES rubrics were performing better on the helpful feedback item than units that did not use SRES rubrics. Just bringing this grain of salt back again, it's not so much the marking rubric itself as it is everything else that the coordinator and the team has been doing within the unit. Coming to the final point here. One of the other things in this Track Your Progress portal that we have now started being able to do is give exam feedback. So in addition to all of the assessments and everything else they're doing within the semester, once the semester is over and they've done the final exam, using some pieces of work that we've done previously to give feedback on the exam, which, maybe at least in our school, we weren't giving feedback on exams previously, but maybe some schools across the faculty and university have also not been giving feedback on exams. So last year's Education Showcase, we talked about this initiative of trying to create activity level learning outcomes for all of our lectures and tutorials. So for every single learning activity, there were like clear statements of learning that was related to every single activity. Because of this piece of work that has gratefully been carried across the whole entire school, we have now been able to give more granular feedback about exams. So that piece of work enabled this improvement that I'm about to talk about. So in the Track Your Progress portal for the final exam, at a very base level, we are now able to give section marks for exams, which we weren't previously giving to students. So on the Psych 101 exam, it has 6 sections of MCQs, and here's the mark that you got for every single one. But beyond that, though, every single lecturer was able to apply those level learning outcomes to the MCQ question that was being asked on the exam. So obviously we can't give the question and the answers back to students, but we have this actionable statement of learning that was related to all 100 questions on the exam. And so we can report that back to students and then say correct or incorrect and how they actually went. So that was only possible because of that other piece of work. But beyond MCQ exams, we also now for our SAQ exams, so in the second and third year units that have these extended response sections, those same activity level learning outcomes can be associated with what they're having to demonstrate in each of these SAQ sections. And so we're able to report back to students. I'll quickly wrap up, you're right. Able to report back to students automated through SRES with some manual intervention, but largely otherwise automated, what it was that was required of them on that section, how they measured up against it, but then importantly, where to next. And I have to credit Dan with this fantastic, wonderful idea. I still kick myself that I didn't come up with it. But from the final exam, how this question and the content that was being assessed on it actually projects forward to the next unit that students are doing. So in Psych 2012, this short answer question that they were doing, here's how this directly relates to Psych 3010, which you're doing next semester. So that feed forward projection. So in addition to that though, the one change that we were able to make in addition to that though, was rather than just saying, here's how it directly relates to the next unit that you're doing, based on your performance on this particular thing, you may need to completely re-engage with this content before you do the next unit, briefly revise it, or you can feel confident about how you are going into the next unit based on how you went on this particular exam. So that's something we're able to do. This is something we're going to be covering in one of our subtle grants that we have in terms of evaluating how these feedback exam portals are possibly affecting students. We could roll that into that. Main takeaways, though, would be to take advantage of SRES, Cogniti, whatever it is, but also where possible, try and put evidence-based practice into anything that you are trying in your units. Cool. Thanks so much.
We've probably run out of time for questions, if that's okay. But we're going to have a break now, which means a 10 or so minute break, which includes lunch and includes asking James a question. Outside. So there's a lot to do. If we could be back here.